on a couple of those things as well.
Okay, and is are these results available somewhere?
Yes, they are. I believe it was one or two of those papers that I cited. Those results will be available, and yeah, and actually we're working on issuing a new paper right now that has also looks a little bit further in the correlations with backscatter and seabed types.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Okay, we'll pass over to Mike for the next presentation.
All right, I know we're getting close to dinner time, and I have a lot to cover, so I'll jump right into it. For those who are unaware, I think most of you are, the center, as I'm going to refer to it, is actually two centers under the same roof. We have the Joint Hydrographic Center, which is a collaborative center with UNH and NOAA, primarily funded by NOAA, and a lot of the research that gets done under this roof is primarily associated with the programmatic priorities of NOAA's mission. The other side of it is the Center for Coastal and Ocean Mapping, primarily the same people, just a different hat. And so this relationship builds on the JHC, and that allows us to work on projects outside the scope of those programmatic priorities of NOAA. It lets us work with the private sector, other government agencies, and philanthropic organizations. And so the reason to highlight this is because we ended up doing a lot of acoustics research across a whole variety of themes. I've split it in this case into 4 kind of sub-themes, being calibration and physical acoustics, data acquisition and quality control, and then we have backscatter processing, and finally backscatter products and added value. So you can see some of the topics that I'm going to touch upon. I'm going to try and keep the context in these themes as I move through the presentation and kind of hint at how they're relevant to this group and some notable questions. I'll finally end the presentation by directly talking to those objectives that Craig mentioned in the morning. So we'll start with calibration. The center has a history of working on various calibration methodologies for multi-beam backscatter data collection, starting with laser pointer. All right, I'll just use my hands. Starting with the reference hydrophone projector methodology, it's a classical method, moving into trying to adapt the fisheries target sphere methodology from multi-beams to standard lines, as well as some of our newer extended target calibration methodologies. And one of the recent efforts we did, which we were just talking about with him actually, was a intercomparison of all these methodologies. And we learned a lot from this. Primarily, one of the big takeaways is that something like extended chain target methodology takes about a half hour to calibrate your system. Whereas this classic reference hydrophone projector methodology, to do right, took about 11 hours. So that's a huge difference in time. The other thing we ended up finding was that there were some inconsistencies with respect to the actual calibrations. And this highlights specifically just how complex calibrating these systems is. Because we're doing this in the test tank facility, which is ideal. And so if we're seeing these inconsistencies within this controlled environment, we're going to have to be concerned about how they translate into the field. But for the majority of sonar users, they can't take their system to a test tank facility, or they don't have a test tank facility. So we're going to look to calibrate our systems in the field. And the trend that's kind of growing is the use of reference sites and standard lines. And as a broad overview, the way we do this is we measure the C4 with a reference to the initial system. This initial system may be absolutely calibrated, in which case the scattering strength of the C4 becomes physical scattering strength, or you can use a non-calibrated system, in which case it becomes a relative calibration, which we just do qualitative comparisons. But as this interest grows, we have this project where we're trying to help NOAA establish a variety of these sites for NOAA fleet to calibrate their systems across the US. There's 2 kind of open questions with this as we continue to move forward down this path. One is that once you've calibrated, you have a reference site, you want to take your surveyor, go out, calibrate the system, collect your data, make your products, and then you submit it to your hydrographic office. How do you carry that calibration? Right? As far as I understand, there's not really an avenue for NOAA currently, and I don't know elsewhere, but it's really important to try and carry that calibration as we move forward and use this type of methodology. The other is, if we're all going to be doing this, and there's going to be all these sites around the world, is there any benefit to having some central directory or maybe a website that at least points to these sites on a global level? Because we aren't all just operating within our own territorial waters. Sometimes, we talked about that collaboration between Inframer and other folks. And so if you can go to those calibration sites and just pull it quickly, that'd be great. But let's dig into what actually is going on with this cross-calibration using reference sites. This is going to feed into some of the work by John Hughes Clarke and some of the students, both Yvonne and Miguel, who's here. We'll start with Yvonne, who looked to calibrate the seafloor across 5 different substrate types in British Columbia. We use this K80 system you see down here. Well, actually, this is Yvonne right there. What was great about this was that he was able to cover the full bandwidth of most of the commercially available shallow water systems to date. And as always, I love these John animations showing how everyone was able to use the system to collect reference angular response. So when you look at Ivan's results here, we have 3 of them for 3 out of 5. You get these kind of 2D surfaces, which nicely demonstrate the scattering response with respect to not only grazing angle, but frequency. And while this was done in the context of calibration, it really feeds nicely into that multispectral, multi-frequency work that we're all kind of interested in. John's been working on in the past. The reason we do this, there is a clear frequency dependence between measured backscatter. And so what's nice about this is we're able to move from this angular response type of analysis, shown by the black lines here, into a more frequency dependent analysis. And there we're able to kind of start to learn how these different sediments respond to different frequency with respect to grazing angle. So here you can see a nice call out is that between 30 and 40 degrees versus 70 to 80 degrees, sand's behavior as the frequency lowers is opposite. So there's things to learn here. But I think we've historically been looking at this frequency dependence in a range of about 100 to 400 kilohertz, which Xavier has said is kind of cute. And the reason he says it's cute is because these areas are relatively consistent in their frequency dependence and response. So we're not going to learn too much from that. We really want to start pushing down to these lower frequency bandwidths where we can observe changes in the backscatter response with respect to frequency. So that was a nice added value there. But we're going to go back to calibration, and I'm going to briefly touch upon some of Miguel's work on how to use those calibrated C4 sites from Ivan to then work out sector reference beam pattern, or sonar reference sector beam patterns. Because this multi-sector, multi-SWAT systems, they're going to require calibration for each sector, each SWAT, and then each mode, each set of settings. This becomes quite a complicated, daunting task. So I'm going to leave it there. They'll elaborate in a few minutes, hopefully. I don't run out of time. But I'm now going to switch gear a little bit and start to look at how the environment is impacting our backscatter measurements. So John has historically looked at these kind of bubble swash effects. And as we know, bubbles are one of the higher scatterers in the water column that can foul up our backscatter measurements. But even when we go out with a system such as the swap hole that does not aerate our sonars, we can observe changes in the backscatter that we measured after significant wave events. So this is a before and an after gale. And what the implication is here is that the bubbles are being injected into the water column, and they're lasting for a lot longer than we initially expected. And again, beautiful John animation showing the extent of how far these bubbles can penetrate into the water column. Here we're seeing them go as far as 30 meters deep. And this isn't bubble wash. This is actually wave-driven bubble aeration. So when John looks at the backscatter and he takes a slice of this water column and superimposes it on the backscatter, he's able to observe how the trends in the backscatter are varying and correlate them to these wave-driven bubble-induced events. Another, continuing with this theme of environmental impact, the impact of the environment on our measurements, we have Tony Lyons and Jen Dykstra actually looking at the stability of the seafloor. And so this brings up a really interesting question of what are we measuring when we're going out and measure the backscatter? So Tony and Jen have deployed this landed system here, equipped with a WBAT, a couple 38 to 270 kilohertz transducer, as well as a set of cameras, and they deploy that off a Star Island, off of New Hampshire, for 5 months at a time. And so I think these pictures are really illuminating in terms of what we're measuring. Here, we're in a nice calm environment. The detritus, as I was told, it's actively respiring. There's fish schools all over. And this is after storm events. Same piece of seafloor, just right after storm events. And so what this has an implication for is this implies that there's going to be a change in the backscatter. And Tony is going to observe this. He's seeing trends on both a weekly level related to these significant wave heights. So we have wave forcing impacting the stability of our measurements. And we also have observed monthly trends that we're not quite sure yet what they're correlated to. This is early days of this work, but it brings up some really important questions. One is kind of related to calibration. If we decide to set up a reference site calibration here, and then we keep calibrating at different points in time, we're putting a bias within our calibration. Conversely, if you manage to calibrate within these kind of steady states, and then you conduct your survey over an extended period of time, you're still likely to see some variation in your final backscatter products attributed to this natural instability of the seafloor. But this isn't all bad, actually, right? I mean, the third point I want to point out is that this is telling us something about the environment. For those who are interested in habitat mapping, there's something to be gained here. And you don't even need to calibrate your system because this is going to walk no matter what related to the environment. So this is really interesting work as well. Moving on, we're now going into processing data acquisition. This has been a topic that we've been brought up a couple times. I won't go into too much detail on BSIP because we've talked about it. We know that if we get the same data set to these different processing packages, we get different results. So what was spun out after the BSIP, initially by Giuseppe, was the OBSD project. And it had this goal of addressing some of these issues by providing open source algorithms and a framework for evaluating these processing solutions. The reality is that it's been a project that's been somewhat stalled. The initial first year, we looked at trying to use Jupyter notebooks so that it would be in a direct type of competitive environment with the manufacturers, and that didn't necessarily pan out. So now we're kind of in this gray zone, and I think we'll end up all discussing kind of how we want to move forward with projects like this, incorporate some of Alex's work and Rita's work. I did want to point this out. This is actually another interesting project. This is spun out by the Multi-Beam Advisory Committee, led by Paul Johnson and Ken Jerem. We've talked about these forums in terms of how we can communicate and discuss things. And this is a great example of the ocean mapping community. It's built on GitHub, and it's a public resource for all to improve their data quality and to help troubleshoot these systems. And so it's easily updated and shared. It's taking advantage of GitHub's natural issue tracking capabilities to open up discussions on different topics within that are relevant to, in this case, the ocean mapping wiki. See what it's not. It's not meant to be an SOP. It's not meant to replace manufacturer guidance, but it is a forum of types. And at least within this, there are two pages on backscatter processing. One nicely points to the prior efforts from this group on the recommendations guidelines, but it can still be filled out. And like I said, I think it's a great example of maybe how we want to talk about creating an open forum. Moving on into products. Did pretty good, actually. Moving on into bathymetric and activity-based approach for C4 segmentation. This is REST. It's something that was created by Giuseppe, and it's a C4 segmentation algorithm that is taking advantage of our bathymetry and our backscatter to improve the segmentation model. It's built on these principles of topographic openness, pattern recognition, and texture classification. And we've been successful in using it to classify large areas of Lake margin, cold water reef habitats, as we mentioned before, sand and gravel resources, et cetera. And so we want to kind of think as how we can continue to use something like this to add value to some of our other products. For example, I don't think it's a new idea to use the segmentation to improve our calculation of the angular response curves by keeping apples to apple comparison as we move forward. Now I'm going to directly address those research priority questions of the group. Calibration. You should probably add to your account project. We really do need to understand how to efficiently calibrate these systems, particularly multi-sector, multi-swap. Open question on deep water systems. How do we even start to approach that? And then, as I mentioned before on the standard line slide, how do we ensure reproducibility and carry that calibration with the data as we move forward? In terms of environmental monitoring, I think that instability in the backscatter measurements, the seafloors is really important to try and understand its impacts, as well as what value and information we can learn from that instability. And of course, a lot of John's work that I presented today looks at how we can use water column monitoring to improve and understand what's impacting our measurements. And again, software, we have this open discussion on how we can get open source processing algorithms and workflows to and improve our confidence in the results we're getting out of them. How can the second iteration of the backscatter working with advanced research and technology? Well, I think part of it is going to be reissuing or updating this recommendation of guidelines. There's been a lot of improvements in terms of our understanding of physics, but so that directly relates to chapter 2. Within chapter 5 and 6, we have different manufacturers that have entered the space, as well as different data formats and ways to process things. And it would be good to have that reflected and shared with the wider community. In terms of what role does industry play, it's kind of funny that I came after the presentation from Rezon and normalized backscatter calibration, but I think industry is going to be a really important partner in this moving forward, because this, and I guess I think about it in terms of 3 different software, or 3 different industries. First, we have the sonar manufacturer, and we're really going to need to make sure we have cooperation with them in terms of understanding how to appropriately calibrate their systems and to appropriately correct for them as we move into backscatter processing. And what I'm highlighting here from Rezon is I talked with Gorm on one of our projects related to that calibration work, and it wasn't clear to me from the backscatter guidelines how to handle the TVG. And he set it up. He sent me the TVG curve, and I was able to update it. And he then asked how we can get that information out. And so this is a great example of how we can work with that. The software vendors, again, can be clarity in terms of what is required if there's any confidence in the output products. And then this third group's a little more philosophical. Well, not it's very real, but it has more philosophical questions of what are we measuring, what's the C4, what is important to you, and how does backscatter relate to those constraining factors that you need to make your work. If I was to summarize it all, I'll address the last bullet point as how should backscatter work moving forward? Well, I think that it can and should serve as a unifying voice to this community. There are outstanding issues that we all face, and a singular entity that speaks to those issues, representing the whole, can really help to push the research in the direction that's needed. It can help clarify and add weight when we talk with manufacturers and software vendors. And it also has the ability to possibly serve as a central location, a repository for the state-of-the-art knowledge and state-of-the-art and current knowledge in the field. right? We would do that pretty fast. Actually, no, first time. These are the PI contact information. I'm around this week for the breakout sessions to talk as well.